Thank you very much. Sorry I can't be there in person with you, everybody. I was, I can see a camera view, which is really nice. I almost went and made a cardboard cutout audience, so I can, complete with, different groups that are usually here. Or then I thought maybe potatoes with toothpicks. Almost made that diorama, but I didn't have to, luckily, because there's a camera set up. Technology these days. Thanks for coming to my talk. SaaS, Security is a Second Thought. I must admit I came up with the title first and had quite a few chuckles to myself, as I like to do. Big fan of puns and alliteration, but I wasn't really sure what this talk was going to be right that moment. There's lots of thoughts I have floating around about this topic for the last few years. And so it could be SaaS, you're building a SaaS company, or SaaS, you've got lots of SaaS services in your company. It's a bit of both, but focusing a little bit on the latter. So really, I want to start with this statement here that remember to build a secure company, not just a secure product. Startups and SaaS companies are often big, offenders here of focusing on the secure product. They're very technical. You've got all of the people are very technically involved right through to the end. Right to CTOs might still be technically involved, and then everyone thinks they know how to build a secure product, and often secure company is kind of left out a little bit. So I'm not talking about how startups should do things. They have enough problems even coming up with the product and making that secure. So, you guys keep doing that awesome stuff. But once you get a bit bigger and you've hired some people, you've got some money, you're underway, you can start breathing again. It's a really good time to look back and look at the pile of SaaS services that you've left behind, sort of really sitting on top of this huge pile. I like the imagery there of a pile of SaaS, like a big dirty pile of laundry, Not that I think there's anything wrong with SaaS, and it's really useful and probably where every company is going to be heading. But yeah, it's something that we associate with the more you have, kind of the bigger the problem is, right? The average company now actually has about 50 to 100 SaaS services, probably. Don't quote me on that. I did lots of different searches and they all come with different answers, but it's around that range. And it's only going to be getting more and more. I used to do some security awareness training, and every time right at the beginning, I'd ask people, tell me all of your SaaS services that you're using. And you get the best responses from the most varied group of people, right? You have like finance team giving you all their SaaS services that they use, and that's gonna be a completely different picture to, marketing, to engineering. So you really got to ask everyone in your company these kinds of things, not just think that engineering knows best. I'm often guilty of that. Where are you getting the services from? Are you still telling your employees to go out and buy whatever laptop they want, and they come back with the latest RGB gaming thing on whatever operating system they feel like, and they've installed all of the tools, npm install the world, and they're running root Amazon credentials? At some point you're going to fall over with that secure company part, even if your product's really great. It's all based on a bit of anecdotal experience, but hopefully there's some relatable pieces in here for you and the places you work. If not, just a chuckle. So yeah, what are the first SaaS steps here? Well, take inventory of your SaaS. It's pretty easy. You go and just write them all down. It can be hard if you don't actually talk to the right people. So keep that in mind. We're going to classify some data. What are the SaaS? What are you putting in these SaaS companies? Maybe we can think about some risks associated with that, and then even consider some controls. I see these are big security terms that I normally find boring, but I've come to love these things because this kind of underpins everything I've found. The real piece, though, is that you're going to be able to communicate, and how else can you empower everyone to make great security decisions if they don't have the accurate, reliable information sitting in front of them that's in the context of the work that they do. If they do, then they can make the decisions themselves, and that's how you're going to scale in your security posture. So, of course, to solve this problem, I'm introducing a new SaaS product. No, just kidding. Really, what I've got is just 99% Neo4j, which is a graph database, because it happens to solve a big part of my problem here, and a little bit of Open Policy Agent, which is quite interesting, and we'll get to at the end. I had to fight very hard not to register a domain name and come up with a name and print t-shirts for this one, because I keep getting, but what convinced me is my email reminders that my last year's random domain names are expiring, and I just let them go these days. Yeah, it's pretty sad. So these days I just not even create them. So that first piece, take inventory. Let's make a list of all the third-party services you use. Which ones are critical to your company, and how are you defining critical? It's probably easy to think about, well, if Amazon stopped existing, then we probably would have a hard time recovering from that. But how much money do you have to lose before you consider something critical? Or is it loss of customers, or is it loss of brand reputation? I mean, think about that stuff now, and think about which services are critical. And for those critical services, how do you contact them? Like, you've paid for the stuff, but how do you can you call someone on the phone? As a top tip, you can figure this out before an incident. You can find the phone number and the contact details before you really need it. You don't want to be like on a Friday night. I don't know why it's always a Friday, that you're like trying to contact your domain registrar and you find out that they're not available till Monday, and even then it's going to be hard to talk to a human. Does your CEO need to tweet at the CEO of the SaaS product in order for you? Is that your communications channel? Figure that out before you need it. Because are you just a $10 a year customer to your domain registrar, but your domain is actually controlling your $100 million business? Yes. Interesting questions. Who looks after all these services? Often this is how these lists start. I just want access to stuff, so who do I ask? And I'm sure you've been in the situation where you get this list and you're like, okay, cool, here's the service I want, but this person no longer works here. And so you're like trying to find out the next person. Oh, well, this person passed it on to this other person. Now I can't, it's just really hard even just to find out a simple answer like, how do I onboard myself? And then the flip side of that is who's still got access to everything. Are you still thinking about who's got access to all your services? Which contractor still has a random, a login to your MDM suite or maybe your Amazon instances? Just simple questions like this. And one that's often overlooked, what are the business requirements of the SaaS product? Why are we even using it? Often this is completely overlooked and we just assume that everything's really important, but some stuff is not. Figure out why you use it. If you can't figure out why you use it, maybe it's one that we can just easily get rid of straight away. But if you do use it, write down why you use it so that in the future how important it is and what kind of business function it's solving. That would be really useful. There could be some services that you instantly think, oh, nah, that's a crappy service. I don't want to be using that. But actually, the business value it's giving your business in particular is very, very high. And so it actually can change your perception of services that maybe have a bad rap. So I have a quick demo of some inventory stuff. So let's have a quick look. I've got this graph database, and I've gone and put in a whole bunch of services, which are these blue nodes, and connected them to owners, which are these people. And so you can see that there's like this relationship there. And that's the basics of a graph. It really is just a graph. But what's interesting is when we start zooming out and we get a bigger picture of this, we can start seeing some things that we can't normally see about this data. Like, oh yeah, we've got some people there that are not doing anything. But if we ever found, hang on, we've got a service over here that doesn't have an owner. So that's interesting. I want to check out, what's that service that doesn't have an owner? GoDaddy, that's probably going to be quite important. Maybe that's from the first version of our app, and the developers were just, throwing everything they could at it. But now, what domains are still there? This is really hard to answer if you're looking at a list of services to answer the question, what's not there or what doesn't have an owner. So these kind of big overviews like that can be really helpful. And of course, you can extend that a bit, and you could say, all right, well, show me, let me just do this. Show me all of the teams now. So I want to know which people are in which teams. And again, like, you're going to get quite a big mess of stuff pop out. But hang on a second, we've got this service here, which is owned by 2 people. And now you can start seeing, well, the engineering team owned it, and also IT team owns it, just by knowing which people are part of which teams and which people are this team. So maybe here, this one maybe was brought in by engineering and then now has been transferred to IT or something. So you might want to check that one out and update it. So you can really find some really cool stuff like that. You don't, of course, have to always be looking at it in this graph view. You might just want a list of, hey, what team has what service? And you can imagine that this this kind of data will be feeding some list of services in your company or things like that. It doesn't actually have, I'm not saying we need to be looking at a graph all the time, but this is all these different lenses into this data. And I think we had that example of teams. Teams with no services at all. So that's interesting. I mean, it's probably good that the execs don't have any services they're looking after, but what about product team? They probably do have some SaaS services, so maybe we need to go and talk to them and ask them how they do their work. So yeah, that's what some of the real cool insights that we can do at this stage. You can dig a bit deeper. You can start looking at your servers, your databases, security groups, your infrastructure stuff, open source projects. Open source projects are a great one because they're often seen as this beautiful repository of golden code that is always sanctioned and perfectly usable, when really some of the quality can be quite varied. Don't get me wrong, there's some amazing stuff out there, but there's also some stuff that leaves some things to be desired. And often I've been in a meeting where someone said they were worried that it was, how are we going to bring on board this new service? How are we going to pay for it? Because the problems that people are having are the procurement part, not necessarily the, should we be using it from a risk point of view? It's more like, oh, well, how do I even pay for it? And if it's open source, you're like, oh, sweet, easy. I'll just throw it right in there because I don't need to pay for that. So I think I've got a little bit of an infrastructure piece here. Let's swap over. The hardest thing was coming up with these example companies. I spent way too long creating the structure of the company. So maybe you've got something like this where you've got some load balancers. These ones are all security groups, and these ones are a load balancer, and you've got servers here. So each of the colors kind of maps to a different type of thing in your database. And now we've got some relationships, which is indicating the security group configurations. So now this is looking great. I've got my MySQL database. It's got a security group. The 3 app servers have access. There's a front-end server which doesn't have access. Great. And then maybe I've got some SSH stuff happening here, and I've got some, HTTPS traffic coming in here. I mean, it's quite a simple example, but I did create something exactly like this to solve a problem where I legitimately had trouble figuring out which jump host do I have to go through to get to this host, because we had a bunch of different environments. And as soon as I graphed it out, we found, all these hosts had this relationship to this one security group, and it was, misconfigured and allowing too much access. So yeah, it's very cool to visualize it. So let's imagine we introduce a bit of a problem here. We'll just throw in a relationship that really shouldn't be there. So this is, of course, you'd be querying the stuff from your Amazon API or something and automatically throwing it in here. So again, now we've got this our database sitting back here. We've got our load balancers and things. But hang on, there's this relationship now from our public piece straight to our database with SSH access. Now, whether or not that's actually exploitable or something is a different question, but clearly something's misconfigured here. And we wouldn't necessarily always look at this big picture to find that out. Maybe you could actually start looking for this kind of misconfigured setup already. So I might say, well, hang on, what's the shortest path between a public security group and a database? And so suddenly this is looking much more interesting for us. We have our happy path, which goes through the load balancer, through the app server, where we can apply all of our controls and things, and then we go down to our database. Perfect. But hang on, what's this one here? So now it's much more obvious. And if you're going to start automating this, you could start querying, okay, show me this paths from a public security group to the database, but not through an app server. I'm not interested in those paths, because they're covered in a different way. So now suddenly we have the real piece that we're looking for. And you can imagine this being a perfect screenshot to include in an automated alert. So you can run this now and you can say, hey, here's a picture that looks wrong because we have some results here, and this is actually what's happening. And someone can then, it's much nicer to go and address that. So you've figured out where all your stuff is, and now we can start classifying things. You can say, oh, we've got customer data here, we've got business plans over there, we've got credit cards maybe, we've got some source code, we've got some documents. Really just go through all these different things that you've created and turn them into an actual asset, and then start classifying those assets. Maybe you have an existing risk framework that you've got, maybe you don't. I'm sure you can find some different levels of classification. Now, this is the actual code that will insert these things into the database. It's saying, okay, create a credit card asset thing, and we're going to classify it as confidential. And then we'll create one that is source code, and we'll classify that as sensitive. And then maybe legal agreements are sensitive, maybe business process internal. Whatever you're deciding, and you're going to have different things that those levels mean, but you can classify them on the assets themselves. And then again, this is what the code would be to add those relationships. You're saying, oh, well, Amazon stores customer data, or Amazon stores IP, or something like that. You just need to write all these in, and then suddenly some pretty cool things are going to pop out. So let's again have a quick look. So yeah, some pretty messy overview. Maybe there's some things we can find here. Oh, hang on, like we've got a service with no data that's being stored. That's mega as well. That's weird. Why are we even using that? So that might be something we'd be looking into. Maybe someone hasn't written down what data we're storing, but maybe we're actually not storing anything, and we can remove it. But you might start filtering this a bit more and say, well, actually, I'm kind of interested in confidential data. And so suddenly the picture's looking a lot different. It's saying, these are the services now that are storing customer data in my environment, or credit card data. And this picture is much different. And now we can start having this, you can imagine this could actually be a query that you save. And if you're trying to describe how you're storing data, you could just always refer to this visualization. So now you've got, what data you're storing. You think about the impact if you were to lose some of that data. And you've got the classic CIA, confidentiality, integrity, availability. They can be prompts for you to try and think of the actual impacts, and it's hard here to go to the real impacts. It's like real impacts, like we lost sales, we lost customers, we've lost money, we have got fines, more competition. For example, if you lost your source code, you may not immediately lose money, but your competitors may now know your secret, code that they're going to start using, and you're going to lose your competitive advantage. It can be hard to get to the actual impacts. It can be easy to say like, oh yeah, well, if our source code was lost, then we'd probably get hacked or something. Well, getting hacked is not the impact. What happens once you get hacked? What are the different ways in which you can actually suffer some loss? And then write those down. Now, we'll kind of actually have all of the pieces to say we almost have a risk for the service that we've got now, because we've defined what we're protecting, what the impact would be if we lost that data, and if we connect them all together with a threat, we've almost got a risk. And it really is a case of like Colonel Mustard in the conservatory with the candlestick. You now have a really great picture of your SaaS services. I should say this is no substitute for like proper risk assessment and threat modeling, but if you're not doing any of this, it's a really great start. If you give these kind of things to the people that you eventually hired, if you eventually hire a risk analyst, or you've got your CISO coming on board or whatever, and you give them this data as like, oh yeah, here's our starting point, they probably jump in the air a little bit. Usually it's a bit of a abysmal state that things are given over to them. I've got a quick risk demo here. So this graph we can extend now and say, well, I want to see the impacts of that data. So for the confidential information, what's the different impacts I can have? For customer data, maybe I've got lose company. I've decided it's that important, or lose customers, or I'm going to lose some sales. And you can really start seeing that I haven't really defined the impact on the service itself, but now I can start seeing, hey, well, what services are kind of involved in a confidential, data, and what impacts would there be? So this query is almost like your risk of this data now, and you could save this query and rerun it in the future if you were ever wondering like, oh, what does our data look like now? You could go a bit more specific, like maybe you want to say, which assets would eventually end up in an impact that has caused you fines. And so now you can look at that, and you can even say, well, which teams are those? Because I know that the owners own the service of their members of teams. Now I can start saying, well, to get to a fine, I could lose customer data, I could lose credit card data, maybe there's some logs that I could lose, different types of ways of being fined. and you can start drawing those kinds of pictures. Maybe there's some things here that stand out. And you can go from the other end where you might say, okay, well, given this particular service, maybe Amazon, what kind of impacts can I expect from Amazon service? And now you can start seeing, oh, great, okay, I've got these types of impacts for my Amazon service. And this really, you're really getting a nice picture of, hey, this is now a risk assessment for this Amazon service I've got. I can keep this query and continually come back to it and see if it's changing over time. Someone might change the way that we store customer data, and then that might change this picture a bit. These are just things that never get updated, by the way. Like, you create them once and then they're in a document in a wiki, and then that's it forever, and until the person comes across, and it's hard to figure out whether or not it's accurate or not. You might start wondering, what about services with no impacts? That might be interesting to look at too. Why do we have services with no impacts? Well, is it because they are storing, external communications and promotional material? We haven't figured out what impact that would be if we lost those. Or maybe it's like we just don't have any impacts, anything they're storing. So that's another one we'd want to look at. And we could actually see, oh, well, which team is this person in? Engineering. So I can probably go and look into that a little bit further. So now that you've got like an idea of these risks of these services, you can start considering your controls. And these are the ones that we already know about, and but in the context of what they're protecting, they're so much more powerful. Your multi-factor authentication, if you can now relate this to, all these services that store all this data that has this impact, that's why I'm using MFA everywhere. And it can be much, much easier to communicate this with other people in the company. If you end up discussing someone something and saying, hey, we need to do this MFA, if you don't have this kind of data to refer back to, it can be hard to convince somebody why it's even important. It can be, so it's very easy for someone to say, no, we know what we're doing, don't worry about it, it's fine. But if you all have a common data set to query, it gives you that common language, and you end up making the better decisions for it. So what the result is, you're really going to start communicating. You've got different views into the same data. Maybe you've got a marketing manager adding a new SaaS product, and they want to know, hey, have I got a similar SaaS product? And what impacts are there on this SaaS product? And I could query that and figure out. Or maybe a developer's adding a new feature, and they've classified some data as confidential, and they want to know what impact what impact that has. What controls do we normally have in place for confidential data? Or your security auditors wondering about, services that store card data, and you could pull up that information for them. And not to forget the business benefits and opportunities. If the, people making business decisions can look at the way that you're mitigating risk across your services, maybe that means that they can take on another risky service. It's all about the opportunities of adding more risk to business, really. You need to be confident and exactly sure about how you're actually managing risk of all your services. You might decide, we don't want to add this service because we don't have any controls that would cover this kind of risk. But on the flip side, maybe there's a riskier service, but you have really great controls in place already. And so you can actually take on that business benefit. And it all comes back to automating it. So we've been exploring it in the database at the moment, but what I really want to do is automate it so that I get alerted when something pops up, that I want to make sure that every day all third-party services still have an owner that's employed by the company. As soon as someone's no longer employed, I want to know about that. And in fact, if you had the data for when somebody was going to be offboarded, you could send them an automated message and say, hey, you're in charge of 3 services and you're leaving the company soon, so can you hand these over to somebody else? And you could start seeing it shifts from being something that's typically security-driven to being putting the autonomy in the hands of the people who are actually making the right decisions. You might have S3 buckets. Everyone knows that S3 buckets need to be private, but then we still need to create public buckets for things. So if you're not classifying the data that's in your buckets, it's hard to say which one should be public and which one should be private. And it's all well and good to have alerts on, hey, this bucket has been made by public. But if you can classify the data that's inside there, then you're going to have a much better contextual alert around, like, a bucket that has sensitive information that was made public, and that can change the way you respond to it, and you can respond quicker. I want to generate some documentation from this. I'm thinking maybe I can generate my information security policy from this, because all things in there should link back to risks and link back to impacts. And so if I'm reading through the information security policy and it says, oh, I must not disable my antivirus software, it can be hard to understand. You're like, oh, you might have this preconceived notion of like what an antivirus software is, or it's outdated, or it's not going to work, without really understanding what it actually is protecting and what controls are being mitigated by this, by this tool. And if you can find that out, it's much easier to make better decisions about things. So, for example, this is Open Policy Agent. It's this language to define policies. It's normally used for like API design and things, where you can centralize your access policy to things, and think of it like a giant simultaneous equation solver. You just kind of put your facts in there, and then you put your inputs in, and it tells you whether or not it's able to be solved or not. It's a really neat way of doing it, and it allows you to write quite succinct policy that is going to be really neat to actually and fast to execute against as well. But this is neat and all, but I wanted to make a more generic use case of it, where we're now thinking about, hey, I want to query the data in my graph database, and now have a policy to say, well, if there are any inputs that any services without any impacts, that I get alerted about that. So there should be no services without impact, or that there are no public paths to the database, right? And that's the one we saw earlier with the database suddenly having SSH access on it. So I think I even have a demo about that. Let's see if that's going to work. So I've got this all running just in some Docker containers here. And here you can see it's just a post request to the API. This is the Open Policy Agent. It's just an HTTP API. And you can give it a query. And if you look back at this first example, whether or not it should be allowed access to a machine, and you can write a policy for that. So, Jeremy, I've got my password wrong, so I'm expecting, allowed is false and unauthorized. But if I actually got my password right, I think I put it as super secret passphrase, which is obviously not a good super secret passphrase, but here we go. Allowed is equal to true. And you can even just change the box to a prod box, and that would change the way that this is evaluated. I'm not going to get into the actual language of this because it's quite a mind bender, but it's really neat. I would encourage you to go and check it out if you're interested in this kind of stuff. So to actually apply it to what we're doing, I've got another little script that here, essentially it's going to run my query against the graph database, and then throw that data into Open Policy Agent and see, what do you think? What does this work? What do you think about this data? And so there's the policy that it's going to evaluate. It doesn't really matter about the details. I'll just run it for you and see if it actually goes. Let me grab the thing I need to copy. So you can see that the rule that we were expecting, that we had no public access to databases, that's actually false. That assumption's false. So we need to go and action that. Probably worded a weird way, but you can see if we actually fixed this situation by deleting that, we went and remedied it, and we removed that weird relationship by changing the actual Amazon infrastructure and re-querying it, obviously. Not just hiding the problem under the mattress by deleting the relationship. But here we actually want to now rerun that query, and we should see that our test passes again. So yeah, it's a bit convoluted, but you can imagine you can start building some more complicated policies that actually are including way more data from other sources as well, like your employee directory or other. Well, it's kind of endless really. So wrapping back up again, security is the first thought when we're doing things. If we have accurate information that's up to date, if you're just updating a value in a table of who's owned something, the value of updating that's quite low. You may be saying, oh, well, in the future, someone will have the right service owner for the service. But if you're automating it to this extent and taking all these different views, the value is much, much larger. It's kind of this cascading effect that updating a small piece of information has a large effect and a large value. And I think that's really going to motivate people to keep it going if you can actually see the value that you're getting out of it. Especially when it's easy to consume. You've got to work on making it interactive or queryable, or maybe it generates the documentation for people. Like, not everyone needs to run the actual graphs in the graph database, but you can see already like different ways in which data is going to be easy to consume, whether that's an automated alert includes the screenshot of the picture that's gone wrong, right? And then that makes it actionable because the information is available right there, right now, in the context of the person who's doing the work. And so you're really farming out the security decisions to the actual right people, and they're able to do and make the right decision because they have the right information. Maybe it's maybe it ends up as a question to your security team, but how great would that question be when someone comes to you and they've done all of the research and they have all the data and they're just actually asking a real, this is an actual tricky question. Those are the ones you really want to be solving. And to keep it automated is to make it continuous all the time. It's not just when we have an audit that we look at these things and go through our services and who has access to stuff. It should be just all the time so that we immediately know when something's gone wrong. Imagine in the next audit, you tell the auditor, well, in the last year, we actually had 5 instances where we didn't have the right access controls here. And this is how we found out about it, and this is what we did about it. Really, really great, as opposed to a point in time, and then we're not sure what's happening outside of that. So yeah, we got to the end. Thank you very much. This is supposed to be a GitHub repo that you can clone and play with all this data and do the stuff yourself. But in typical last minute slide, it's amazing that some of the demos actually worked. So I'll maybe send a link out somehow through Discord or however, if you're interested. If you really do like this kind of stuff, send me an email. That's my the way to subscribe to my mailing list. And I'll keep you updated if I do some more cool work on this, and if you want to know about it. Yeah, thanks very much, everybody.